All right, well, welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for our final webinar in this three-part home energy retrofit series. We'll just get started right away because we have a lot to cover. So today we have Grace joining us from Kootenay Solar to speak about solar PV installations in BC. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples from all of the diverse and beautiful places we are joining from. So the land on which I am currently joining you from is now known as Nelson, but for thousands of years was occupied by Indigenous populations and is the traditional territories of the Snakes Nation, Silks Nation, and the Ktunaxa Nation, and is home to the Métis and many diverse Indigenous persons. So I just like to acknowledge with gratitude and respect that the joy that I am privileged to experience daily in these mountains and waters is in thanks to their generations of stewardship. So while I quickly introduce CEA and the Kootenay Clean Energy Transition Project, in case we have people on this call who haven't joined us yet, we're just interested to know why solar PV interests you. So if you could just take a minute and just in one or two quick sentences, tell us why you joined us today in the chat. And in the meantime, I'll just tell you a little bit about the Community Energy Association and our project, the Kootenay Clean Energy Transition. So CEA is a BC-based nonprofit that has been working for over 25 years with government and Indigenous communities across the province to reduce emissions, conserve energy, and help progress us to a low carbon and healthy future. The Kootenay Clean Energy Project is a project that was developed to address shifts happening in the energy efficiency, renewable energy, and space. So through KSET, we want to help Kootenay and Boundary communities prepare for a more energy efficient and healthy future through training and capacity building for the building industry, community workshops to help increase knowledge and awareness, and pilot projects that we can test and scale up. So thanks to the generous support of the organizations that you see listed at the bottom of the screen there, we're offering this free webinar series as part of that community knowledge and awareness building. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, this is part of a three-part series. So if you missed the first two sessions, one on financing programs and retrofits in general, and the other on electric vehicle and installation considerations, you can find recordings of both of those on our website at www.shiftshappening.ca. And with that, I'll pass things along to Grace. And then Grace, as you get your screen set up, I will just touch on a couple, there we go, on a couple housekeeping items. So as you would have seen as you joined us today, we are recording this session. So the recording will be found posted on our website that was on that last slide, shiftshappening.ca. I'll also send a link to that recording along with the slides and an email to everyone on the call here and everyone who registered. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand as Grace is presenting or put them in the chat. I'll let Grace know that there's a question in the chat and we can get to it right away just to kind of keep this as interactive. And then finally, at the end of the session, we're doing a feedback poll. Really appreciate the feedback. It helps us when we are preparing future webinar sessions. It's just quick 5 questions. So if you could give us a minute of your time there just at the end of the session. Questions. And then that's it. Grace, go ahead. And we do have some responses in the chat as well.
Yeah, thank you guys for that early engagement. I see from Mark Barron, interested in hearing about how PV would work in my home. Hopefully we'll touch on that. And then Jen, I just want to confirm you can see my screen.
You know what, we could. I don't know if I've lost it. Nope, I don't see it.
Let's try one more time here. Does that work? It looks like maybe says one participant can share at a time. Is there someone else sharing their screen?
No, so that's just the setting, but I've stopped sharing my screen.
Okay.
So you should be able to. It's okay, this is what we get for practicing.
You can practice all you want, but
yeah.
no time. I apologize, guys. Just give me a couple of seconds here. Just stop sharing that. And
That's okay. Well, why don't I read out loud what we have in the chat here while you're figuring that out. So Mark's interested to hear how PV would work in his home. Great. Sterling, she's going to be graduating from UHD in December with a bachelor's in computer science and wanted to gain more insight of this increasing knowledge and awareness. And we do see your screen there. Grace.
There we go.
John likes the idea of being energy independent and would like to get connected with local suppliers and contractors to install PV and wind power. Great. Kootenay Solar is a local company to the Kootenays here. And then Doug is wondering if PV would work within future home upgrade.
Okay, some great questions there. I hope that the majority of those questions will be covered by the presentation, so I'll jump into it. So first of all, thank you for everyone joining on this very rainy Tuesday night. Or I hope it's sunnier where you guys are. It's very rainy in Invermere, which is where I'm based. That's the headquarters of Kootenay Solar. So as Jen introduced me, my name is Grace Storvold. I work as the commercial design and sales rep with Kootenay Solar. Previously, I was working as the residential grid tie sales rep with our sister company, Rocky View Solar. Kootenay Solar has been around for just over 5 years, and we've done 5 years of installations, both residentially and commercially. It was founded by Eden Yesh and Stu Bilodeau. Eden comes from a background in nonprofit, and Stu is a Red Seal electrician. So they both, Stu is sort of our operations guy, and Eden is the brains behind the operation. Or they're both the brains. So both of them have young families, and we're very interested organically in decentralized energy production. So solar felt like a natural transition for them. And 2 years ago, both of them made the jump from working part-time with Kootenay Solar to it being their main gig. We now have a team of about 12 people. We work with electrical subcontractors all around the Kootenay region. So this presentation has been largely geared to the residential solar market. I work as the commercial grid tie sales rep, so if there is any interest or questions about solar for businesses or nonprofits, I'd be happy to answer those as well. But as you are, this is the Retrofit home series. We'll be largely talking about solar for homes and solar specifically in BC. So some of the things we'll cover, we'll talk about how panels work, the different components of solar, including inverters, racking. We'll talk a little bit about BC net metering program and the utility rates and the economics of going solar, sort of the idea of your return on investment. And then we'll take a look at bigger picture, the idea of shifting the energy paradigm, a little bit about carbon reduction, and then finally, what you're probably most interested in, which is grants and incentives that could be available to you to help you with the cost of a solar installation. So this first visual outlines the key components of a solar module. Solar module, solar panel, those are sort of interchangeable. Solar modules are made up of individual solar cells, which each convert the sun's energy into electricity. The amount of solar cells in a solar panel will depend on the application of the panel. And as you can see in this sort of breakdown, the first is going to be the frame. Frames are typically either black or silver, can kind of depend on what our client wants in terms of the aesthetics of their panel. And then there's a plexiglass layer. That plexiglass layer protects the panels from heavy snow load, hail, and the elements. There's also an encapsulant layer. I won't get too into detail about that, but essentially the encapsulant layer keeps the light from bouncing right off the panels, as silicone itself can be quite reflective, and we don't want that light to reflect. We want it to absorb it. And then the most important part of the solar panel, which is the layers of silicone. So this is a fun fact that I learned during my training with Kootenay Solar, is that silicone is the second most abundant element on our planet. And so a solar panel will have two different types of silicone in it. There's N-type silicone and P-type. You can think of it as negative silicone and positive silicone, and essentially there's more electrons on the top layer, fewer electrons on the bottom to create room for the electrons to flow through when photons light's energy hits the panel, bumps that electron, and creates an electric current. So the separate layers of the panel, you can break it down, but essentially they all serve a different purpose in turning the light's energy into electrical energy. So for residential applications, there are typically two types of panels that we work with. There's a 60 cell panel and then a 72 cell panel. The approximate size of those panels can vary depending on who produces them. But typically the panels we work with, the 60 cells, are 5.5 feet by 3.25 wide. The 72 cell panels will be about a foot taller, so 6.5 feet by 3.25 wide. So a lot of people will ask, what is the benefit of having a larger panel? Is it more efficient? The answer is no, it just physically is larger. So it's important to keep in mind that even if a company quotes you for the biggest panel, it doesn't mean it's more efficient. It just means it's physically larger. And we actually prefer to work with smaller modules, especially for a residential application. They're typically easier to maneuver on a roof. The 60 cell panel we're currently working with has an efficiency of about 20.7%, meaning that if there's 100 watts, you can imagine 100 watts of energy hitting the panel, they'll be able to convert about 20.7 watts of direct current. So the production of solar panels is driven largely by the utility scale market. So when we think about the actual production of panels and who are the main market shareholders that are driving the production, there's a lot more money in the utility scale solar market than there is the residential application. So we're seeing an industry trend towards larger modules, which actually has an interesting impact on our ability to safely install modules. So going back to the idea that bigger doesn't mean better, we really like to work with 60 cell panels, but it's very dependent on the home. We'll typically just try and maximize your usable roof space and work within our client's budget. So I included this graphic just to outline an important thing to note about solar panels, and that is that their power performance will degrade slightly over their lifespan. So this graph demonstrates the power performance warranty of our 60 cell panel that we prefer to install over its 25-year lifespan. I quote lifespan because a solar panel doesn't just die after 20 years. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So yeah, the lifespan of a panel can be much longer than 25 to 30 years. Just after, as you can see, after 25 years, that panel is going to perform at about 80 to 85% of efficiency as opposed to the day it was installed. Most panels will lose about 2% efficiency the first year that they're installed. It's just sort of a thing they do. I should have prefaced this by saying, if anyone has super technical electrical questions, I am not an electrical engineer, but please throw them at me and see how well I can do. So this is a graph that outlines how solar irradiation works in Canada. Solar irradiation refers to the amount of usable solar energy we have in a given area. So if you look at this map, the eastern Kootenays are quite high. So we're in and around that 1,200 to 1,300 kilowatt hours available per kilowatt of solar installed per year. That was a very confusing string of acronyms, so I'll break that down. But essentially, if we look at 1 kilowatt of solar installed in the eastern Kootenays, that 1 kilowatt of installed panels will produce unshaded about 1,200 to 1,300 kilowatt hours. So we can break that down further, and I just for comparison's sake, we look at Germany and California, who are some of the largest adopters of solar in the world, and they're both at about 900 to 1,000 kilowatt hours per kilowatt per year. So that bodes very well for solar installations in and around the Kootenay region. We have a lot of solar radiation, viable solar production available to us. So the average single detached family home will use about, and this is in BC because we have quite an electrified grid. We don't burn a whole lot of fossil fuel or a lot of natural gas, so we have quite high electricity consumption. So as I said, an average single detached family home will use about 15,000 kilowatt hours per year. So when we consider our installations for residential applications are typically between 6 kilowatt to 12 kilowatt. So a 12 kilowatt array, which is as I said, a fairly typical installation, would produce with this solar radiation map in mind, approximately 15,600 kilowatt hours per year. So offsetting the entire consumption of that family home with that installed PV. So when we talk about optimal orientation of panels, there are things to consider. Obviously, throughout the year, in the winter months, the sun is going to be lower on the horizon. We're going to want a steeper panel angle. And in the summertime, you want a lower angle. So to average this, we say that a 45-degree angle is optimal for annual solar production, and oriented due south at 180 degrees. And we'll talk more about mounting options in the next couple slides. So we've talked about what a panel looks like and how it converts the sun's energy into usable electrical energy. And an important part of that is that the electricity that's produced from the panel comes out the back of the panel throughout the junction box, through the wires in the form of DC current. In Canada, all of our appliances are AC currents. We need a way to convert that DC energy into AC energy. So the difference between AC and DC lies in the direction in which the electrons flow. So in DC, the electrons flow steadily in a single direction or forward. And in AC, electrons keep switching directions, so they go back and forth. And DC is a more dangerous form of electricity, so we want to have AC electricity coming into your home. And that requires inverters, which is what I'll talk about next. So this visual outlines how the different types of inverters function in a solar array. So the first is sort of the OG technology is a string inverter. So a large centralized inverter that would typically sit in the electrical room of your home or by your electrical panel and plug in as one central point. With a string inverter, all the panels go down to the weakest link. So it's functions similarly to a Christmas light string. If one light goes down, the whole string goes down. If we look at this top string inverter illustration, when one panel is shaded, the whole system registers 50% shading for all of the rest of the panels. So a way to combat that would be to use a string inverter with power optimizers, which allows the panels to act independently, but you still have a central point of failure. So if the main inverter has an issue, that can be frustrating to have to deal with. So the most common types of inverters that we install for the residential application are microinverters. Microinverters convert DC to AC electricity right behind the panel. So the only thing running into your home is a wire right into your electrical box. So there's no DC current running into your home. So it's a lot safer. And the microinverters that we typically work with are an AP Systems microinverter. They plug in one microinverter per 2 panels. They function really well. They have a fantastic monitoring system, and their warranty is really robust. So just as I showed you the power performance of a panel, microinverters also have a power performance warranty. So we typically work with products that have a 25-year power performance warranty. And then just to circle back to string inverters, it's not that they don't have, they can't have a really fantastic application. We would use string inverters for, say, a ground mount system with absolutely zero shading. Those are when string inverters can be a really fantastic option. And the other thing that string inverters can do, sorry, I missed a point there. The other thing that string inverters can do is allow you to plug a battery into them. We'll talk a little bit about battery storage in the next couple slides, but typically 95% of our systems we do not install with batteries. The economics just aren't there, but we'll talk about that in the next couple slides. So I want to talk quickly about the different types of residential solar systems that we install. So there's three main ones. There is a grid-tied, typical residential solar install. We have grid ties with battery backup options, and then we have fully off-grid options. So for a grid tie solar system in BC, we use something called net metering. Net metering requires smart meters. So BC Hydro, FortisBC, and Nelson Hydro. Nelson Hydro will swap the meters for you. BC Hydro and FortisBC should all have installed smart meters already on all existing homes. And essentially what those smart meters allow you to do is pull from the grid when you need energy, when it's nighttime and your solar isn't producing, and then during the day when your solar is producing and you're not using as much from your electrical, or your loads are lower than what your solar is producing, it will feed it back into your utility meter and register the kilowatt hours that you're putting back into the grid. So it's net metering is a one-to-one system, one-to-one ratio in terms of the kilowatt hours that you pull from the grid and the kilowatt hours that you put back into the grid. So then you look at grid tie systems with battery backup options. Typically, we would look at battery backup options for anyone who has a medical device that really requires constant electricity. You know, if you had an oxygen tank that needed to be plugged in and you couldn't go without power for a couple hours, that's when the quality of life conversation comes into our install. And then for an off-grid application, we would typically explore off-grid as an economically viable decision for properties that are being developed where power lines are 500 meters away, 500 or more meters away. So if you have to pay BC Hydro to have lines trenched to your home, you might want to explore an off-grid application in that scenario. But typically, in Canada at the moment, and specifically in BC, the economics just aren't there for installing an expensive battery option unless it's a quality of life issue. So I just wanted to briefly talk about what it would look like if you were to install a battery option. So similar to a typical system where you would need your solar array and your inverter feeding into your electrical panel, but you would use a charge controller to control the rate at which your batteries are being charged. You don't want to undercharge or overcharge. And then you would need the inverter to convert the DC power coming from your batteries into usable AC current for your home. So for most off-grid applications in Canada, if it's a property that's being used in the winter, you would also need to supplement your power with a generator. You could have really good production in your panels. You just have we have shorter days. So you would need either a massive battery bank or a generator that you run for a couple hours a day for an off-grid application. So the next thing I want to talk about is the type of racking we typically install on residential properties. So this is just a visual. Here on the left is the racking we work with most often. It's a pre-engineered aluminum fast rack that sits flush on, this is typically installed on asphalt shingles or asphalt torchon, and it utilizes the existing pitch of a roof. We secure it with something called a mini tech, which is a self-sealing 100% leak-proof fastener. And that fastener itself comes with a lifetime warranty. So oftentimes we, get a lot of people very concerned that we're penetrating their roof, but we obviously acknowledge that and want to work with products that people feel comfortable with. So that product itself does come with a lifetime warranty. This middle one here, this is called EcoFoot, which is a ballasted system that we typically install on flat roofs. We don't see a whole lot of this for residences unless it's a really modern home with a flat roof. Most will be pitched or flush mount roofs. But this is what we see for most commercial roofs. And this is a fantastic system for flat roofs that don't want any roof penetrations. As you can see, the angle of the panels is significantly less than this ground mount system to the far right. The panels sit at a 10-degree tilt and are spaced 20 inches apart to account for no shading between the rows. So this third option here on the far right, this is one of our ground mount options. This can be a great option for people who have farms, who have a lot of land or really don't want solar up on their roof, and they have the means and the capacity to do so. It can also be great for homes with really high electrical consumption because you're not limited to the available space of your roof. You can install much larger systems, and we can actually typically install ground mount systems more quickly because we are not limited by structural permitting. It doesn't require any structural permitting for a ground mount as long as you can coordinate the excavation. So the trenching of the wire back to your electrical panel, we can typically get that done quite quickly. You also need sonotubes or some sort of footing for the racking to sit on, which has to be fairly robust.
Hey, Grace, we had a question. Sorry to interrupt. We had a question come in the chat just about mounting assemblies. Calvin just asked if the assemblies typically shed enough snow during winter so that they're able to still produce, or do they need regular cleaning? 45 degrees was mentioned earlier, which seems fairly steep. He imagines would self-shed. So any kind of insights into snow shedding off of those systems?
Yeah, we do get a lot of questions about snow shedding, and the argument that our structural engineers make is that panels are plexiglass on the top, so they're very slippery. The snow that's hitting them is typically not able to grasp onto that plexiglass. It's going to shed snow more availably than, say, your asphalt shingles. And then in terms of the angle, that 45 degrees is quite steep. You typically won't see 45-degree pitches on residential homes. We'll see the average pitch that we work with is about 26 degrees. So, I mean, the difference in production between 26 degree tilt and 45 is quite marginal. 45 is just optimal for if you're looking at it annually. So our ground mount systems will sit at 45 degrees because we have control over that. Whereas with a pitched roof, the cheapest, the most affordable, and the easiest is to mount the existing tilt of the roof. So even if it's a flat roof, you can still get really good production.
Great. And then if I'm not mistaken with those ground mount systems too, you can get some that you can change. You can actually change kind of the degree that it sits at throughout the year.
Yeah, so we have some clients that will adjust the angle of their panels. The racking that adjusts is extremely expensive. So for us, it's sort of a cost analysis versus benefit. So the amount that you're going to increase the efficiency is actually not going to be worth the cost to install specialized racking like that. People also ask about tracking modules. So there are existing products on the market that will track the angle of the sun. They are astronomically expensive. Hopefully we'll see that technology become more affordable, in the next couple of decades, but it's not one that we recommend for our application.
Great, thank you. And then I'm just going to sneak one more question in since we're chatting. Mark just asked how many kilowatts in a 60 module panel?
How many kilowatts? So the panels, so the 60 cell module that we work with is 400 watts. So a kilowatt is 1,000 watts. So it's 0.405 of a kilowatt. If that answers that question.
Great.
So I guess I'll touch briefly on this. So these are just more images of different ways we can install panels. So over a deck, over a carport, and then obviously I mentioned a ground mount system and a flush roof system. So these are typically the ones that we'll do, but if there is a deck or a carport that has been built to code, that's the key point, built to code. We'll often have people reaching out to us about DIY projects, and we'll have to sort of break the news that no, unfortunately, we can't build a solar panel array on top of your chicken coop. But thank you for reaching out. So I just want to talk briefly. So this is just more a visual of that racking I was talking about. This is the kinetic fast rack for flush roofs, and this little thing is called the mini tech. So the auto sealing, 100% leak proof, lifetime warranty, all that. And then what I'll talk about is some of the limitations about installing solar, specifically on homes. So we are limited to the existing electrical infrastructure, including the main panel, and the disconnect rating and the transformer size outside of your home. So typically most homes we're installing on will either have a 100 amp panel or a 200 amp panel. And there is a lot of complexity here, but just our electrical team has distilled it as simply to me. With a 100 amp panel and a 100 amp disconnect, we can install up to 6 kilowatts of solar PV. And with a 200 amp panel, which is what we typically see for new builds, 200 amps is sort of standard moving forward. We can install typically a 12 kilowatt system. This doesn't mean that you have the available roof space to hold a 12 kilowatt or a 6 kilowatt array. We'll certainly maximize your usable roof space, but we want to work with something optimal. It is south facing. We will install on east and west. People ask questions about how much production you'll lose, and typically we'll say about 10 to 15% for an east or a west facing array. So small, but still we will work with south facing first if we can. People often get fixated on that offset number. So during our quoting process, we'll try and get that offset number as high as we can feasibly. But oftentimes when you have really high electrical use and limited roof space or limited land, if you're doing a ground mount system, we just can't get it to 100%. That doesn't mean that it's still not a viable system. That won't save you money on electricity. It's important to sort of limit your expectations. And we'll always try and get the most or work within your budget. But what I say to people is that every panel that you add, even if it's one panel, will pay itself back in terms of electrical cost savings over the lifespan of the panel. Typically, if the system is designed well, you can see between that panel will pay itself back 2 to 3 times over the 25-year lifespan. So yeah, important limitations to keep in mind. So this is a rhetorical question because I think there's quite a lot of you on the call. Maybe you can put your thoughts in the chat, but I like to ask this. Does anyone know what the cost of gas is at the moment? Just picture it in your head. You don't have to say it out loud, but I feel like most people would be able to answer that question within 10 cents of accuracy. It's something we're sort of constantly calibrating as consumers. But when you ask the question, how much do you pay per kilowatt hour for electricity? Most people are not able to answer that. So I just think it's interesting. And maybe I suspect that this group is a little bit more knowledgeable, showing interest in solar. So maybe that's a question you all can answer, and good on you. But yeah, I just think it's interesting to explore because we know a lot about one form of energy that we consume, and we typically know very little about our electricity, our consumption, how high our consumption is. And I think it's critical that we understand what we're paying for electricity as we anticipate higher and higher costs for it. Nice. Thank you, Ron. Got a good rate there. So in the solar proposals that we provide, which I'll talk a little bit about at the end, we quote about 4% inflation year after year. So at the moment in BC for a step 2 rate, we're on average at about 12.5 or 12.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And as you can see with this graph, it's anticipated a 4% inflation. By 2045, we can see about we can predict to be paying about 40 cents per kilowatt hour. There are some more pessimistic, or you could say realistic, whichever way you want to phrase it, predictions about that rate of inflation being about closer to 6%. So if that were true, we'd be looking at paying just over 60 cents per kilowatt hour in 2045. So when we compare that kilowatt hour cost to places like California is already there. So the cost that they're paying for electricity is extremely high, which is why you see such wide and regular adoption of solar. And I think it's pretty clear that we are following that trend. We're just about a decade behind. So when you think about 60 cents per kilowatt hour, you're talking about very aggressive, quick payback periods, which we're already seeing with solar. So this graph just outlines the cost per watt of solar and how drastically that cost has come down over the decades. So if you look at 1977, so that is the very early adoption phase, it was $76 per watt. So today at a utility scale, we can see the cost of goods as low as 0.25, so 25 cents per watt. This obviously varies at a commercial and residential scale, so utility scale is quite a bit cheaper. And that's just for the cost of goods. We're not including labor or any additional costs in that. It's just the cost of goods. But really what this graph shows is that the cost of solar has essentially bottomed out. Oftentimes I'll talk to people who are very skeptical about moving ahead with solar because they think it's going to get cheaper. And I just say, I don't know how it could. It's simply never going to be cheaper than it is at the moment. What we might see, and what we do see, is small increments in efficiency year after year. There hasn't been any sort of major breakthrough in the last 5 years. We've seen most panels will be in and around 15 to 21% efficiency. And keep in mind that that efficiency rating is based on lab conditions. So obviously a real world nominal context, very different. But when you look at the reasons people were installing solar panels in the 1970s, up until about 2015, it was largely motivated by people's altruistic desire to go green and invest in low carbon solutions. But about 7 to 8 years ago, that shifted from being a nice thing that people did to it making financial sense to do so. So it is cheaper today to invest in a solar system for your home and lock in the price of power at today's rates rather than pay the utility company for the next 25 to 30 years. So as I mentioned, a system will typically pay itself back 2 to 3 times over during its lifespan. And you can look at payback periods using grants and incentives as low as 6 to 8 years. Typically, if grants and incentives aren't being used, you can look at 9 to 15 years, and you have a system that generates power basically for free for the remaining 20 to 15 years. So very, very cool.
Hey, Grace, just on that topic of costs, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Just kind of considering, you know, all of the costs involved with installing solar. Mark just asks what the approximate cost per watt would be for installed residential solar.
Yeah, definitely. So It definitely depends on the project. There's a lot to consider. But typically what we see, what industry standard is $2.50 a watt to $3.50 a watt. And we typically come in just under that at about $2.35 a watt. But it varies depending on the location of the project, the complexity. There's a lot to consider, which we all build into our quoting process. Thank you, Mark. So I want to talk a little bit about the significance of solar, because it's something that is very exciting. And if I had a glass of wine and I was with my friends, I could talk for hours. But the significance of the paradigm shift from the centralized command and control that fossil fuel production and energy production in our world has had, and that shift towards localized, decentralized power production, and how solar, wind, and alternative energy solutions offers in terms of taking power back into our own hands. So yeah, very cool thinking about how many of the issues we see socially, politically, environmentally stem from who holds power, literally and figuratively, and how solar is an interesting way to combat that. So I'll briefly touch on the idea of microgrids. We're already seeing microgrids come into play, but they will more and more with wind energy, solar energy, and battery storage. So when we look at comparing mega projects like massive dams, massive drilling rigs, all sorts of massive utility scale energy production, and switching that to focus on community, municipal energy production, and the environmental and economic resilience that entails. It's very exciting. And then also when you consider climate disaster and the unprecedented weather events that we've seen throughout the 2000s, flood, storms, fire, there is an argument to be made about more micro generation and having grid resilience. This just demonstrates how much market share solar has taken up since 1995. This is at a global scale. So by 2050, about 73, or we hope by 2050, about 73% of the energy grid globally will be from renewables. So let's hope that happens. And solar will be a massive component of this, utility, commercial, residential scale. So this is something that is very important to us in BC. About 95 to 97% of our electricity in BC is generated by renewables, which is fantastic, but there is a difference between electricity and energy use. So we're still driving internal combustion engines powered by fossil fuels, and sometimes use propane or natural gas for heating options. So what we're going to see and what BC has laid out is the electrification of these products. So, you know, more of a shift towards electric vehicles, a switch to heat pumps and electric heating. And so what's really important to consider with that is that solar when you have more electrical consumption, you're going to have higher electrical costs. So investing in solar just becomes or is a smart financial decision as our grid becomes more and more electrified. So has anyone not heard of the Canada Greener Homes Initiative? You can just answer. That's rhetorical again. Okay, so Mark asked a question about net metering, and we'll touch on that in the Q&A. Canada Greener Homes Initiative is a federal program. It's incredibly awesome. We love it. It's a huge driver of the residential solar market at the moment. And essentially what it is, there's two key components of the initiative, the one being a $5,000 grant, the second being a $40,000 interest-free loan that you can use for major retrofit upgrades for your home. Awesome, Ron. Very glad that you received the full 5,000. So there's a couple things to consider. This is a federal program, so there's a couple hoops to jump through in order to access that grant and loan. And the main components of that are going to be a pre-retrofit and a post-retrofit energy evaluation. So the pre-retrofit energy evaluation, essentially an energy advisor comes into your home, registers the retrofits that you could benefit from in your home, like updated insulation, different windows, and then they'll almost always, probably 9 times out of 10, include solar PV as a viable retrofit option for your home. So that energy advisor goes home, uploads that report to the Canada Greener Homes Initiative, and that allows you to apply for the grant. Then we would come in, do our full quoting process, and install. Once the system is installed and hooked up, you would book a post-retrofit energy evaluation. And thank you, Jenna. If you guys want to access in the chat, there's an energy advisor tool. Just allows you to access energy advisors in your area if you are thinking about using the grant or the loan. And then once your system is hooked up, you would do your post-retrofit energy evaluation that just confirms that, say, our solar installation made your home more energy efficient, at which point the grant and the loan would be released to you. So it's a fantastic program. You know, there are some steps, but it's 100% worth it to do. And then when you include that $5,000 grant into the cost of your system, you can look at really, really quick payback periods. So I mentioned at the beginning that I'm actually the commercial design and sales rep. So I have worked with residential clients in the past, but now my focus is shifted towards working with businesses and organizations, nonprofits. So I want to talk briefly about a very exciting new initiative. So this is the Clean Electricity Investment Tax Credit that the federal government announced at the beginning of this budget year. And essentially what it is a 30% refundable tax credit. So paid in the form of a check or through your CRA account, 30% for your capital cost investment into solar PV. So when we look at the simple math in a BC net metered system, 40 kilowatts of PV can be installed for approximately $100,000. And the net cost of that system utilizing this tax incentive is going to be around $70,000. In 2023, you can stack that tax incentive with something called accelerated capital cost allowance. I should also preface this saying I'm not an accountant. Please consult your accountant if you are utilizing this tax incentive. But our understanding is that 2023 is the one and only year that capital cost allowance and the investment tax credit will be allowed to be stacked. And as I was mentioning, capital cost allowance is the depreciation of your asset written off at 100% in the first year. Solar panels are, we assume, a 27% rate for that write-off. So if you were to utilize both, stack the ITC and the accelerated CCA, you can look at a net cost for a commercial installation at about $51,000, which is awesome. So I have to touch on that briefly for anyone who's a business owner and thinking about moving ahead with solar. This is our quoting process. So this is just what our estimate form looks like. All of our entire quoting process is free up until the point that you sign on with us. So if you are interested in getting a free quote, I'll just copy this link and post it in the chat. Actually, for the sake of time, I'll do that at the end. So just to run you guys quickly through our process very quickly, we offer an initial free estimate. We use a software called SolarGraph, which lays panels on top of your home. We adjust the pitch based on what you tell us the pitch of your roof is, and we use your utility bill to input your utility data. That will allow us to give you an idea of the cost of your system, the return on investment, and the different metrics associated with a solar install. Once we've done our free estimate, we'll follow up with you, make sure that we make the necessary adjustments if you're not happy with it yet. Once you're happy, we'll send out our electrical team to get boots on the ground and confirm our design. We'll adjust from what they say. So maybe you have larger capacity for solar based on their site assessment. We can update that. And then once we've had our electrical team come out, that's when we send out your final quote. So we won't send out a quote that hasn't been reviewed by myself, the owner, and our electrical team. And you can sign that quote and have an install done within, permitting takes about 2 to 8 weeks. So within 2 months, typically, depending on how busy we are. And then we offer monitoring support. We have a 5-year workmanship warranty and 25-year power performance warranty on both the inverters and the panels. So very robust. We're not going to leave you high and dry. So this is something I want to touch on briefly with you guys as residents of the Kootenays, largely, I assume. So one of the things that we've done is, as we've scaled our business, to reduce the amount of travel that we do, we've subcontracted out a lot of our work to trusted electricians. Not only does that mean that we get to travel less, but it also means that we're able to educate partners in the Kootenays as to how to install solar, and it cuts down on the cost. And we really like what we've done so far. So we work with A+ Electric. A+ is based out of Trail. They serve the Nelson, Castlegar, surrounding region. Bighorn Electric are based out of Cranbrook. Arrow Mountain Electric, another subcontracting partner, not listed, but they work with us in Creston. Marker Electric in sort of the Grand Forks area. So wherever you are in the Kootenays, we'll work with a trusted subcontracting partner to hook up your solar. And I think that's all I have for you. I think I'm a little over time.
No, you're good. We were taking questions through, so that's fine. But you're right, we do have 5 minutes left. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. This is Grace's contact information.
No worries. If you guys want to contact me, please email me, give me a call. I'd be happy to answer your questions if I can. And if not, I'll connect you to the right people.
Yeah, and I think we do have time. There's a couple of questions in the chat that we didn't get to, and I think that we have 6 minutes left here, so I'm sure we can get to them. So we just had, Mark had that question about net metering. So yeah, on a net metering basis, if we generated more than we used in a billing period, would we get paid back?
Yeah, so it's not based on your billing period, it's based on your annual crediting. So on the date that you sign up with the utility, so your anniversary, if you have more credits, they will pay you out. I'm not sure what it is at this moment in time. I believe it was 9.99 cents per kilowatt hour that you've been credited back into the utility. So annually, if you have more credits than you've used, they will pay you out with a net metering system.
And then yeah, Jeff has a question specific to his home there. He has a 200 amp main service in his home, which feeds a 60 amp sub panel in his attached garage. He's building another detached garage, which will have another 60 amp sub panel fed from the attached garage sub panel. I want to place solar panels on the detached garage. Excess power feedback through both sub panels to the main and back to the grid.
So this is what I would say. Our electrical team are fantastic, and they will do everything in their power to make sure that they're getting as much PV running in the location that you want through that panel. So I can't speak to this question specifically in terms of the electrical constraints, but please reach out directly to myself, and I'll pass it on to our electrical team, and they'll be able to help you out a bit more.
Perfect, thanks, Grace. And I'll include these slides, but also Grace's contact information in our follow-up email. And then Grace, could you repeat the two like subcontractors on your team that weren't on the slide? You said one in Grand Forks and one.
Yeah, absolutely. So, sorry. So A+ Electric, Bighorn, and then the ones that were not listed, just because we brought them on within the last 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
Arrow Mountain Electric, based out of Creston. And Marker Electric in the Grand Forks area.
Perfect, and I'll make sure to include those 4 subcontractors in that follow-up email as well, just so everyone has quick access to their web pages. We have a couple minutes left if anyone has one last quick question for Grace.
Someone's got to have a super complicated electrical question.
All right, I don't see anything coming through, but you do still have a couple minutes. I'm going to start that poll. So if you have a question that comes up while you're kindly filling that out for me, please let us know. And before I start that, Grace, I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your knowledge of solar PV and installation considerations with us. I found that incredibly illuminating, and I already know a little bit about solar panels. So thanks, yeah, for expanding my knowledge, as well as I'm sure everyone's call here.
Thank you for having me. And what I would say is that my background is actually non-solar, so a lot can be self-taught. And there's lots of good resources out there. So
yeah, great, thank you. Okay, so I didn't see any other questions come through the chat. So yes, please fill out this feedback poll, and I'll stay on for a couple minutes longer. Thanks everyone so much. So John, do you install wind power? You just slipped that in there.
Not at the moment. Since we do have 2 minutes, I wanted to avoid touching on this because I think it kind of spiral, but so Eden Yesh, who is our CEO, he is currently working on a net zero business park development, working with First Nations to offer grid resilience and economic reconciliation, and we have proposed that will include wind power. So it's something Kootenay Solar adjacent that we'll be exploring in the next couple of years. So, but not currently at the moment.
Yeah, really exciting. Thank you. Okay. Great. Well, I want to respect everyone's time. I know it's late, especially in the East Kootenays. So good night, everyone, and thanks again so much for joining us. If you have further questions, please reach out directly to Grace.
Thank you very much, you guys. Take care.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.